Okay, ladies and gentlemen, happy Wednesday. Hopefully by now, at the beginning of class here, you guys have submitted your homework via eBackpack. As a reminder, assignment 5.2b, your section 2 questions are in fact due today, so just because I'm upstairs doesn't mean that you get an extra day to do your homework, so please make sure that if you haven't done so by now, you submit that via eBackpack. As we started to talk about yesterday, the Battle of Saratoga is a big moment in the American Revolution. The Battle of Saratoga is the turning point of the American Revolution for many reasons, but the biggest one is the fact that we are going to get help from overseas, but specifically France. Okay, the news of Saratoga reaches Franklin in France, as we said yesterday, convincing King Louis XVI that the time was now, if ever, to get involved in the American Revolution. And the fact that France forms an alliance with us early on, many people refer to France as our first ally. And really, they were. They were the first country to support us as a country in this idea of independence. All right. Obviously, there's some bad blood there between France and Britain, as we said yesterday. France, the loser of the French and Indian War, lost a lot of their colonial possessions here in North America. So, seeing that the Americans have a chance, and if they could tip the scale, the idea would be that in that treaty, maybe some of that land will be given back to them. And in the meantime, anytime Britain loses any war, it's good news for the rest of Europe and obviously specifically France. There are key people that would end up coming over here during the course of the war. And that's who some of your key terms were on, and that's kind of what today's lesson is about. The first person of mention is a man by the name of Marquis de Lafayette, kind of a nickname that he got once he arrived here in 1777 to the Continental Congress. He comes from a aristocratic family. His birth name is Gilbert. And here he was known as Marquis or simply Lafayette. And when he arrived in Philadelphia in 1777, the Continental Congress decided that it would be best to appoint someone of his stature to General Washington. In 1777, the reality was he was only 20 years old when he arrives here to give his assistance, and he is given the title of Major General by George Washington, which goes to show you how much he respected him in regards to his experience, even though young, and expertise in the field of battle here. Throughout the rest of the war, he remains really attached to the hip of Washington. He will be with him at the Battle of Brandywine Creek, a loss on the part of the Continental Army, and allowing Howe, as we said yesterday, to march right into Philadelphia. And he is with him all the way up until the siege at Yorktown, which turns out to be the final battle. The two, although both technically generals, was much more of a father-son type of relationship throughout the war. Lafayette famously being injured in battle, Washington leaving the field to say, hey, treat him as if he were my only son, going to show the certain appreciation on the part of Washington there. Mr. Rochambeau, or General Rochambeau, was one of the key people to assist in the American Revolution. Okay, he is a little bit older than Lafayette. I'm trying to think years-wise. He's probably in his 60s by the time he's involved in the war here. But nonetheless, his expertise is vital to the victory at Yorktown. Okay, it is Rochambeau who convinces Washington, and we'll get into this in Section 5, to change his strategy, to change his plan. And it's a plan that winds up helping him to win a battle, which was crucial because it turns out to be the last battle of the war. In both cases, both men come here on their own accord. All right, so even though France has joined in an alliance, this was something that, as a commander, as a general with two people with expertise in battle, it was worth them coming here. So aside from France, we also, as we mentioned, or started to mention yesterday, the Dutch as well as the Spanish, all right, not just individuals, but countries as well, showing us support. And how do they show us support? Money and supplies. Okay, specifically Spain, all right, out of New Orleans, up north along the Mississippi River, supplies would unofficially be sent, unofficially meaning that Spain wasn't technically involved in war against the British, but they were certainly one of our biggest fans, so to speak, during the course of the American Revolution. By 1779, Spain did in fact declare war against Britain and therefore became our second major ally for the war. What we also see is volunteers. Volunteers meaning that people weren't looking to get any sort of money or compensation for their involvement in the war, and most notably two from Poland, Thaddeus Kosciuszko and Kazimierz Pulowski, were two people that really outside of the norm, not necessarily generals, but people who were able to lend their expertise in other areas in regards to warfare. Kosciuszko himself was an engineer who was best known for building fortifications, and when he arrived here on the scene in his service for the Continental Army, he was tasked with helping to build fortifications, crucial in the Battle of Saratoga. Okay, it is Kosciuszko who was able to build the major forts there. He is also best known for helping to further fortify a fort along the Hudson River, not necessarily in upstate New York, but it was called originally Fort Arnold, named after Benedict Arnold, but most of you would probably know it as West Point. Okay, he was responsible for helping to strategize and plan out the building of and strengthening of that fort, and we'll look a little bit more at that in section 4. We also have Kazimierz Pulowski, mentioned before. He led and trained American cavalry, soldiers on horseback, which were vital to any sort of battle. It's something that the Continental Army really didn't have, or even the thought of having, once Washington goes out to start recruiting an army. And obviously, if you have soldiers that train on horseback and can fight, especially when these battlefields turn to hand-to-hand combat, cavalry's made an army more maneuverable. It made them more dangerous, and obviously Pulowski is going to do his part in preparing Americans for war via horseback. Of all of the volunteers coming from Europe during the course of the American Revolution, some people suggest that Baron Frederick von Steuben, and he actually has a few extra names, but we'll keep it short to von Steuben here, makes the biggest contributions in his ability to help train. All right, von Steuben was a drill master coming from the Prussian army in what is today Germany. Okay, and he will be assigned via the Continental Congress to George Washington's company in 1777. At the end of 1777, while taking up winter quarters, as we are going to talk about in a few minutes, von Steuben will be assigned to Valley Forge, which was Washington, in his recounts, says was the most difficult time of the war, very cold and long winter, so to speak. It was there, although morale was low, that von Steuben would make sure that the soldiers were training, all right, teaching them how to properly march in formation, not just in battle, but even getting to a battle, improving their aim and marksmanship, okay, giving them some certain tips and how to reload their weapons more efficiently and quickly in the course of a battle, and obviously also the use of bayonets, okay, bayonets meaning those long, sharp blades on the end of any of these rifles or muskets that when hand-to-hand combat took place after a few volleys of shots, it was vital that the colonists and the Continental Army be able to defend themselves here. Washington credits von Steuben for revitalizing his army. By the spring of 1778, it's almost as if the army that went into Valley Forge was not the same one that came out. And although morale was low, and we'll talk about Valley Forge as a negative experience, from a positive light, it was spent as a time to train the army that was desperately needed to win the war. So overall, when you think about it, you see all the support, not just from volunteers, but specifically the alliances that we form with Spain and France and even the Dutch without European help, okay? Without them providing us with weapons, ships, manpower, as we said, okay, France providing us with their navy, there's a good chance that the United States would have never won the war. From the get-go, it became apparent, which was one of Franklin's motives, knowing full well that if the United States was ever going to win, they were never going to be able to do it by themselves. They were going to need, at some point or another, to ask for help from Europe. So as we'll see throughout the rest of this chapter here, there's going to be some big moments in the war that we'll see as to where we get that help from. All right, Section 3, which I'm going to ask that you guys read tonight so that you're familiar with it tomorrow after our quiz. Remember, we have our quiz on Section 2 tomorrow. After the quiz, we'll talk a little bit about life off the battlefield. We've spent a lot of time in this section talking about Washington. We talked about the battles of Long Island, the Battle of Trenton, the Battle of Saratoga, but there's a lot of other things going on besides battles during the American Revolution. Okay, this is a war that impacts a lot of different facets of American culture, so to speak. So this section kind of is a mishmash of that, not looking at any specific battle, but rather what life was like for the army behind the scenes, away from the away from the battles, but also the role of women and African Americans during the course of the war, freed African Americans as well as slaves. Okay, the section finishes off with one of my favorite revolutionary heroes, a man by the name of John Paul Jones. So while you do your key terms after today's lesson, I would suggest reading up a little bit extra on Mr. John Paul Jones. After a very long and difficult year of 1777, George Washington will decide to take up winter quarters in an area that is around Philadelphia. Remember, as we said, his defeats at Brandywine Creek, as well as the Battle of Germantown, allow General Howe and the British to sit in Philadelphia. So by 1777, although success up in Saratoga, Philadelphia and New York City now have fallen into hands of the British. And in order to keep a close eye on the British, General Washington decided to take up winter quarters about 20 plus miles west of Philadelphia in a small area that became known as Valley Forge. And as the winter of 1777 into 1778 proved, it was going to be a long and very difficult time for the Continental Army. Most notably, it is the worst winter of the war. When we're saying worst winter, meaning temperatures, all right, snow, cold. These huts that were built and constructed for these winter quarters were poorly built. All right, so last week we had a fire drill and we were outside, for 15 minutes, and a lot of people had noted how cold it was, and they were cold and they wanted to go into the building. Well, imagine doing that for 6 straight months. All right, that's the harsh reality as to what Valley Forge was, and probably even colder. Coupled with the cold is widespread disease. 1,100 American soldiers made first encampment in December of 1777 at Valley Forge. Hundreds will wind up dying of disease. All right, disease becomes widespread. Malnutrition becomes an issue with lack of food and supplies. But for General Washington, all right, seeing how difficult of a time it was, the genius of Washington, he felt as though that it was important for him, which would be typical of being put up in the Patriots' home a few miles from the camp. During its most difficult time, Washington himself set up a tent right there in Valley Forge to stay with these soldiers here. It's during this time, aside from disease, that we do see a number of soldiers deserting, all right? Not having dessert as ice cream, but deserting meaning that they leave, all right? Which is obviously, if they were caught, as far as their contracts were concerned, at times could have been arrested or even shot on the spot, okay? Washington threatens even at one point that he would shoot any soldier trying to leave, knowing full well, as we've said all along, a theme this chapter, the revolution has now become the army. Without an army, Washington can't fight the British, and therefore can't fight for independence. In the preceding weeks and months, obviously, news will reach different places within the colonies where more food and supplies will eventually be sent in, all right, which is a good thing. Okay, and as the winter gets a little bit warmer, and when I say warmer, meaning 20 degrees or so, it was a time, as we mentioned earlier, in which for Baron von Steuben to come in and train the army. As it turns out, they were at Valley Forge, the Continental Army that is, for quite a while. It is not until June of 1778 that the army will wind up leaving. And many soldiers note that while it was the most difficult time of the war, it was important because the Continental Army was rejuvenated. They felt a sense of confidence, they were trained, and most importantly, what we're going to see in the days after Valley Forge, the Continental Army comes out with a major victory at the Battle of Monmouth over General Charles Cornwallis. So this was certainly a time well spent, and for Washington, a time that he was able to keep his army together. Throughout the course of the war, it becomes important, especially during this time and even after, that we see women playing an active role in American society during the course of the war. With more and more men heading off to enlist in the war, it meant that more and more women needed to step up in order to make contributions at home, but also in many cities and in society, taking on the roles of men. All right, whether it was opening up stores, whether it was ensuring that they had a job in order to make money for families, but even more so, as we said, most colonists lived on farms. They would be the ones to make sure that the farm was successful during the course of the war. So what we begin to see is a sense of independence on the part of women. Okay, recognizing that their role in colonial society and something that had become culturally accepted after the war, the realization is that they could have done much more than that. Some people would say that the Revolutionary War was a time where women were finally seen as on the way to becoming considered equal to men in the way that they were able to pick up for the shortcomings at home or in the workplace and whatever else. However, thousands of women did volunteer to be in the military. Now, when I say military, I don't necessarily mean soldiers. Many of them volunteered to serve as nurses, as field nurses, caring for the wounded in battle, serving as cooks, cooking for troops, cleaning up the camp and what have you. So thousands of women, many of which who were wives of soldiers, or I should say wives of soldiers who were their husbands, would wind up volunteering, especially for those that didn't necessarily have children, would wind up fighting, or husbands who wound up fighting in the war, a lot of times would bring their wives with them to serve in that capacity. However, there are two women of note who did have some field experience in regards to the American Revolution. Again, these are two that are more than less documented. There certainly could have been more women that we don't necessarily know. But first of which is Deborah Sampson, a young woman from Massachusetts who at the age of 21 disguised herself as a man and enlisted in the Army and served for nearly 17 months under the name Robert Shurtleff. So here is someone that recognized that her inability to contribute to the war for independence was not going to be afforded to her based off of her gender, and she took it upon herself to serve. She was wounded in battle in 1782. She was discharged in 1783, and after the war lived a civilian life and was married and had wound up having 3 children. But today, many people look at her as an example of women who have any interest in the military as being one of the first women to serve in the Continental Army. And probably the most famous of all women to be involved in the American Revolution is a woman by the name of Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay. All right, someone who you guys probably have heard or are more familiar with is the nickname that she earns, and a name that will stick with her, is a woman by the name of Molly Pitcher. Molly Pitcher, or again Mary Ludwig Hayes Macaulay, was an example of a wife who was with her husband during the course of the war. And in 1778, at the Battle of Monmouth, which I had mentioned before, which was an American victory coming out of Valley Forge, the story goes that Mary's husband, William, was in charge of one of the major cannons on the high ground. And due to the fact that the battle was fought on a very hot summer day, people were getting tired. There was heat exhaustion, and Mary's job, or I should say Molly's job, as a woman on the field of battle was to bring pitchers of water to those soldiers that needed water during the course of the battle. However, her husband was injured manning the cannon, and it is noted that Molly decided to drop her pitcher of water, and knowing full well that her husband was in an important and strategic position, went on to help load the cannon. All right, she used what is known as a ramrod after a cannon ball is fired to kind of clean out the cannon, so to speak, and push the next cannonball back into the cannon itself. And she remained in that position for the duration of the battle that day. After hearing about this, it is noted that George Washington even commemorated what Molly Pitcher here did, and she earned the nickname, something that stuck with her for really the rest of her life. It was a nickname she was known as around campus, Sergeant Molly, as well as Molly Pitcher. But history has likened the Molly Pitcher name based off of what she had been doing prior to the battle. So there's just two examples of women's contribution to the war, although only two. All right, certainly we remember them and commemorate them for their bravery and heroism. It's certainly an opportunity for women to take the forefront in society during the American Revolution, which I also think is an important thing. And we'll talk about kind of where women go from here after the war once we get to our next few chapters. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to stop here for today. All right, the idea is to hopefully pick up with the rest of Section 3 tomorrow. Keep in mind, tomorrow you guys do, in fact, have a quiz. Okay, quiz will be on Section 2, from everything from the Battle of Long Island, the first slide, all the way up to Saratoga and the turning point. Okay, the last two slides in Section 2 that we covered today will not be on your quiz. Okay, in addition, tonight for homework, aside studying for your quiz, please read up on Section 3, especially the stuff that we just covered. Okay, I did assign you key terms that are technically due tomorrow. There are 3 of them, so make sure that those are due. And you'll see there that your questions will be due on Tuesday. So with the remaining time, the idea is that hopefully you can work on that with the understanding that really try and make sure that you guys don't have homework over the 4-day weekend. All right, make sure you say thank you to your sub. Again, thank you for your attention, and I will be in my office at some point after 3 o'clock today for anyone interested in extra help. But other than that, I will see you all tomorrow. Take care.